Welcome to the CryptoCounsel at Wiley. We are the podcast that decodes the most important disputes in crypto law and regulation. I'm Josh, an international lawyer who does crypto.
And I'm Frank, a finance and technology litigator who also does crypto.
Frank, we have an outstanding guest today. Before we get to that conversation, we have a few quick bits. Are you ready?
I am ready.
The first quick bit relates to a recent decision coming out of the Southern District of New York in a case involving a complaint against Elon Musk and Tesla. The order granted the defendant's motion to dismiss, and it's particularly notable for longtime listeners of the CryptoCounsel because it relates to Dogecoin. You recall discussing that, Frank?
I love the Dogecoin. Dogeverse, the whole Doge, world.
Then you're going to be really excited to hear what the judge had to say in this order. And I'm quoting now from the order granting the defendant's motion to dismiss. The complaint alleges statements by Musk on Twitter to the effect that Dogecoin might be his favorite currency and that he had purchased some for his son. That Dogecoin is the people's crypto and the future currency of the earth. That Musk agreed to become Dogecoin's CEO, that he might put a literal Dogecoin in SpaceX and fly it to the moon, and that Dogecoin would pay for the mission, and the like. The judge noted that these statements are aspirational and puffery, not factual and susceptible to being falsified. They cannot be the basis of 10b-5 lawsuit. Frank, as a Dogecoin fan, how do you take this decision about Musk's statements regarding Dogecoin to be puffery?
I have so many questions, Josh. A literal Dogecoin. I mean, that seems like puffery. That Musk would himself use SpaceX to fly to the moon. I mean, we needed discovery to really find out the truth, but it was the fourth amended complaint. Dismissal was with prejudice. We'll just never know the truth.
Whether Dogecoin will go to the moon, we'll have to wait for another day.
Indeed.
Second quick bit. OpenSea, which is an NFT marketplace, that is an exchange place for non-fungible tokens, received a Wells notice from the SEC. Many commentators in the crypto space have criticized this Wells notice as another example of SEC overreach, a regulation by enforcement. But some may not be familiar with what a Wells notice is. Frank, what can you tell us about a Wells notice?
Sure, Josh. A Wells notice is a letter from the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission telling a company or an individual that they are essentially under investigation and will likely face charges from the SEC, subject to any evidence or any arguments that the recipient of the notice wants to make to try to turn the commission around. But ultimately, it's up to the commissioners themselves to evaluate whatever they receive in response to the Wells notice and then issue a formal charge. But it's a precursor to a charge by the SEC. It's never a good thing. It's not something that you want to receive. And in the case of OpenSea and NFTs, I think most people are worried that this represents the commission's effort to now also regulate NFTs as a security by way of these, regulation by enforcement type actions.
Fascinating. The SEC continuing to make news in this space, which the field will continue to watch. The final quick bit is outside U.S. borders and is a natural transition to our guest. The news is that in Russia, a country that has a ban on using cryptocurrencies as legal tender for regular payments within the country, has passed a law signed by President Putin that allows use of cryptocurrencies for cross-border payments. So not internally, but cross-border payments allowed. This is a complicated international question, a quandary that I think our guest might have an answer to. So before we even get to the intro, Greta Peisch, why would Russia do this?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And second, I think the short answer is Russia is facing a lot of challenges with the international sanctions imposed on its economy as a result of its invasion into Ukraine and is looking to do two contradictory things. One is to maintain control of its own internal economy and people. And second, to find a way around those controls and to see if cryptocurrency can provide one of those paths.
Thank you, Greta. That is insightful analysis and a perfect segue to a broader conversation about international trade, particularly digital trade and digital assets. So you might be wondering, how does Greta have these amazing insights about Russian policy on cryptocurrency? Greta, what can you tell us about your background and how you got into digital trade?
Sure. So I'm a trade lawyer by background, started out at a law firm here in D.C., spent a few years there, then went to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. This is the part of the U.S. government that negotiates trade agreements, litigates trade disputes, and manages trade policy for the entire U.S. government. I was in the General Counsel's office there for 4 years. Then I went to the Senate. And on the Hill, I worked for Senator Wyden on the Finance Committee, who represents the intersection of two things. The Finance Committee oversees trade policy at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, but across the federal government. And also, Senator Wyden is a huge proponent, both domestically and internationally, of policies that foster the growth and use and economic development of the internet, going back to his championing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and even before that. And so that was where I really sunk my teeth into digital trade issues, and then spent about 5 years on the Hill, and then I went back to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and served as the General Counsel there for about 3 years. So as the primary legal advisor on the range of trade policy issues, negotiations, and enforcement for the United States.
Well, we are thrilled that you have brought that incredible experience to Wiley. But tell us more about this role as General Counsel at USTR. I imagine that's a broad mandate.
Very much so. So USTR does two main things. It negotiates trade agreements, so including digital trade, but across the digital trade topic areas, services, goods, agriculture, regulatory issues. And so the General Counsel's Office provides advice on how do you, what's the best way to advance U.S. interests through those trade negotiations. Trade negotiations are essentially contracts between countries, and so you need lawyers to tell you how to draft those things. And then the other main thing that the General Counsel's Office does is the enforcer of trade rules, and this is through certain domestic statutes, including Section 301, which is well known for being the source of the tariffs we have on goods coming from China currently, as well as through international instruments. So in our trade agreements, there are provisions that allow countries to settle disputes between themselves. And the General Counsel's Office at USTR is the office that conducts those litigation matters on the both defensive and offensive side.
You've mentioned digital trade a couple times, and I think most people understand pretty well what trade is. You imagine a cargo ship with vehicles or clothes crossing borders, importing and exporting. Those kinds of tangible goods are somewhat easier to wrap our minds around. What is digital trade, and how does it relate to traditional notions of trade?
Well, digital trade has grown to encompass a lot of different things, but at its core and from the beginning, it was about data flows. So trade does include trade in goods, also services, financial services, banking, insurance, travel providers, all of the different services, architects, anybody can provide a service across borders, as well as goods. And so it started out about, the data that goes along with those services and the goods, exchanging information about how to move goods, find customers across borders, making sure that data is flowing freely between countries and not impeding the trade in those other areas. But from that beginning, it's really blossomed into being more about the data itself. It's kind of where we are today. And so it continues to be a major issue in digital trade is what happens to the data flowing across borders. Are there requirements in countries to localize data? What should be the restrictions on that? Commitments to allow for the free flow of data across borders? What kind of duties or taxes or fees will be placed on electronic transmissions of different types? And even what is a digital good versus a digital service? So there's a lot of issues around digital trade that continue to be discussed and hashed out among trading partners.
I think I'm starting to see a connection. Let me consult Frank on this. Frank, do you think there's any data involved with cryptocurrencies?
A little bit of data, just a little. Blockchain transactions involve tremendous amounts of data flowing back and forth, across the world at all times. So I'm hearing a connection between digital trade and cryptocurrency and digital assets.
Absolutely. And so this aspect of data flow is going to be the subject of potentially international agreements, international relations. The Russia example is an interesting one in that space. Are there any agreements that exist today, Greta, that address digital trade and therefore could cover digital assets such as cryptocurrencies?
Potentially. So I know more about the agreements that the U.S. is a party to, and there are digital trade agreements among other groups of countries that are out there, and some differ and some have new and innovative provisions. For the United States, our most recent trade agreement, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement among the former NAFTA parties, has the most recent and most cutting-edge digital trade chapter. And this agreement does cover data flows. It does commit, with some exceptions, for the parties to allow for the cross-border flow of data and prohibits, again with exceptions, the required localization of data in a country. It also has provisions, for example, prohibiting countries from requiring the source code to be revealed as a condition for doing business. It also prohibits discrimination based on origin among digital services, and has a variety of other provisions as well.
I've seen commentary that refers to the USMCA as North America's first multinational fintech treaty. Do you agree with that?
So I think that refers actually to the financial services chapter of the USMCA, which is also, our most recent cutting edge. Both of these chapters build on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now the CPTPP, that the U.S. isn't a party to, but was involved in negotiating. And the financial services chapter of the USMCA agreement contains similar types of obligations not to discriminate on cross-border provision of financial services, to treat those financial service providers as the same that you would any other country or your own providers, and not put up unnecessary barriers to the trade in financial services. I think, a question that I would maybe throw back to you all, but would be out there and thinking about cryptocurrency in the context of financial service is, where does cryptocurrency fall when you talk about a financial service? Is it a asset, a financial asset? Is it a negotiable instrument? As it evolves and as countries evolve in how they treat it and how it's used, and different versions are created with different backings potentially, I think it raises a lot of questions about how and whether the financial services provisions in particular apply to cryptocurrency.
That is a great question, and it really depends on who you ask. If you ask someone from the government of El Salvador, they might say that cryptocurrency, and particularly Bitcoin, is money. If you ask Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, he might say that certain cryptos are securities. So we get different answers. Frank, how's the weather today? Which one's right today?
I mean, the regulators, even within the United States, are definitely taking each piece of those different categories that you described, Greta, and applying their own framework to some extent to cryptocurrency. So now, to the extent that this treaty creates a different framework with respect to trade and data flow and financial services between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, the U.S. itself has to sort of get on the same page as to crypto in order to, I think to your point, to sort of fulfill this treaty vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico, make sure that there's not problems being created there. So this is one of the big issues that we have with crypto is the classification of it continues to be an ongoing problem. And now it's a trade problem, apparently, is what we're hearing.
One other angle of this, though, even setting aside the specifics of cryptocurrency and how that intersects with trade, and I think many proponents would say it could enhance the efficiency and security of these transactions. At the same time, there's an underlying technology that could be even more important here, which is the blockchain technology. I recently heard an executive from one of the big global shipping companies say that the cost of their paperwork, in other words, the contracts, the agreements required to get a container shipped from point A to point B, sometimes exceeds the cost of the shipment. And so there is this complex legal regulatory regime for cross-border trade, and maybe there's a role for blockchain or digital assets in that. Have you seen any evidence of this, Greta, at USTR or within any of the United States trade partners? Obviously, you're dealing with countries around the world. Have any of them been trying to champion the use of blockchain for these kinds of transactions?
I didn't hear about it so much in my role at USTR, but when I was on the Hill and we were thinking about a lot of different policy issues and challenges related to supply chains, this was something that we were starting to hear from companies as potential tools and answers to the problem. So, as a policymaker in trade, there's a lot of supply chain issues that you're trying to think about, right? Wanting to eradicate forced labor from the supply chain of importers coming to the United States, wanting to eradicate illegal fishing that's depleting our supplies, right? Boats going out in the middle of the waters and essentially stealing fish from our trading partners and depleting their resource, right? And also compliance too, because where something comes from matters for ultimately what tariff it pays when it comes into the United States. And also the parts that are in that thing may matter for the tariff it pays when it comes into the United States. And these are all really hard things to know for a company and for an enforcement agency, which in this case would be Customs and Border Protection. They're the ones that need to know what's coming in, where it's coming from, and does it comply with the very many laws and regulations of the United States that have to do with safety, but also our values, like I mentioned. These supply chains and their complexity are so, it pose such a challenge to answering these questions that deploying blockchain to be able to follow the transaction that's attached to a physical product and have that not only increase efficiencies for those like the shipper, but also answer some of these policy problems is an incredible opportunity. I think that some companies are starting to use it more. It hasn't been integrated into the United States enforcement per se, but I think it's a hope out there that it will become a tool that companies can use and maybe eventually the government can use or require companies to use to solve some of these problems.
That's really interesting. Do you think that the government is going to have a role in leading that? Obviously, you've mentioned some companies, and that's a great way for them to show transparency. Do you see cryptocurrency or blockchain being more explicitly in future trade agreements, or will it continue to fall under broader umbrellas as it does in the USMCA?
Yeah, I don't think that as a tool for tracking, I don't think that will end up being in a trade agreement. I think it could end up evolving into our enforcement mechanisms that we use for things coming across the border, even if it's just as an option for a company to show, yes, my product, I know where my product comes from, I know where the inputs come from, I can show you, and this is the way, and say, yes, that's a way that we will accept. And maybe there'll be other options too, but to kind of fold it into that compliance regime. I see more of in our negotiations with other countries, having these questions about, eventually coming up in negotiations. And I don't think that they have yet. Is cryptocurrency an asset? What kind of asset is it? Do these obligations apply to it, or do we want to carve them out? Another area that we see in trade is sort of regulatory competition, right? Which in my mind means two things. You can have regulatory competition and having a very low regulatory burden that attracts certain businesses and sectors to you. There's another kind of regulatory competition that we see in trade agreements where big countries, often the EU, will come up with a regulatory program first and then try to export it around to all of their trading partners. And so that they're getting compatibility with the way that they're thinking about a new issue or an issue that's important to them. And that's something that's a challenge for the United States. We tend to be a little slower given our political system than some of these other economies. And that can be, though, a big space in the trade agreement, trade policy, where we're sort of confronting a regime that's being adopted in greater areas and needing to catch up and weigh in and have our views and the way we want to regulate reflected internationally.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Josh, because you and I have talked about smart contracts, which is a blockchain technology where if trading partners were to have a broader adoption or a framework to facilitate more of them, could make so much of their trading life easier. But right now it's a technology that is new and sometimes not robustly endorsed, and so people are still slowly coming around to it. But I could see ways in which these frameworks can facilitate the blockchain elements that could make trade easier in many respects if the negotiators of these trade agreements were inclined to begin to fold in some of this stuff. So hearing Greta talk about it's really interesting.
And it certainly seems that, for example, a big global shipping company could utilize the blockchain to have a lot more efficiencies, and then maybe the governments follow along. Greta, you mentioned that sometimes the U.S. government moves slowly. And as a Washington, D.C. based law firm and podcast, we have to embrace that slowness from time to time. But it's not only slowness, we also have occasionally significant changes because of elections. And so, whether you're the global shipping company or a European partner, I think a lot of eyes are on the U.S. election right now because it could have a big impact on tariffs, trade. Is there anything specific about digital trade? And I'll just focus right now on the presidential candidates because they have their differences on trade, to say the least. Are you seeing differences in a digital trade policy between a potential Trump administration versus a potential Harris administration?
So maybe back up a little bit into what's happened in this current administration. So it was the Trump administration that negotiated those obligations I discussed in the USMCA. And then the Biden administration came in, and there was really a rethink about digital trade policy. And in part, this is influenced by the conversation happening domestically. So our international agreements reflect U.S. policy. We're sort of trying to export those policies that we think help our companies and that also create some compatibility with what we're already doing to other places. But in digital trade, there's been a lot of questions now, including whether are there circumstances when we should be restricting data flows? Do we think that it is safe for all types of data, including personally identified data, to be exported to certain countries where we don't know what's going to happen to that data? And so these questions have resulted in a pullback on some of the more forward-leaning digital trade policies that had been the trajectory where the United States was going. And it's almost in a sort of pause right now on digital trade policy. And it's my view that no matter who wins, that pause isn't really sustainable, that we have too great of an interest economically and also with respect to security in shaping what digital trade policies look like going forward. And so there's going to have to be a re-engagement. I think there's a lot of hope that a Harris administration would be able to kind of restart that and bring a fresh look on, okay, can we and how do we address our concerns, maybe our potential desire to regulate in some areas, certain security concerns, but still have that offensive trade policy that is in the interest of our cutting edge tech companies and in the interest of the free flow of information, which I think is in the interest of the United States. In the Trump administration, again, it's sort of speculative. They did support these provisions that were in USMCA, but even there, sometimes there has been a bit of back and forth on some of the tech issues, including liability for tech companies under Section 230, including a bit of a back and forth on TikTok. And so you can see there as well a struggle in some of the digital trade areas. And so I think there's an expectation that that this pause would unpause a bit in the Trump administration. But I think there's also a question of would it be modified in one way or another and look slightly different than it did in the first Trump administration. And so that's all to say this is an area that's very much in flux. And maybe that's not surprising to you because it feels to me as an outsider that the cryptocurrency policy space is also in flux. And there's a lot of competing policy goals and desires that we're working through and policymakers are working through.
It might be helpful to figure out our own domestic policy toward cryptocurrency before we figure out the international trade policy toward that and blockchain. Frank, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's 50 states that have a say too, Josh. It's not just the federal government on that piece. So it's complicated. But I take the point that Greta is making, and I think there is a lot of anxiety is not the right word, but interest among the cryptocurrency world about what does the election hold? And I think that seems like the trade piece is as much a part of that for, I guess, the crypto industry as well. So we're all just sort of staying tuned and trying to read the tea leaves.
Greta, how does your view on the need to have this restart affect your purchasing of Bitcoin, more or less?
I would say neutral. Since I'm unfortunately not a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency savvy person yet. But
he asked you about Bitcoin, not Dogecoin, though. So if he asked about Dogecoin, I suspect you'd have a different answer.
I feel that we can ask honest questions about Bitcoin purchases, but it's a personal intrusion really to get into their Dogecoin preferences. So I think we can let Greta avoid those questions for today until it goes to the moon.
Yeah, the literal Dogecoin on the moon by Elon himself.
Greta, any other thoughts on trade policy, digital trade, digital assets going forward?
Yeah, I mean, you started talking about Russia and sanctions and cryptocurrency there. And I would say, I think similarly, again, to the domestic, what people think of first in the trade space when they think of cryptocurrency is risk, right? And this is the risk of our sanctions being diluted, of cross-border criminal activity. And in part, that's because that's what's in the headlines, right? You don't hear about, and there may be articles about, the innovative use of blockchain to create efficiencies, but that does not really lend itself to a great headline. And so, I think that will always be the first thing that people think about is those risks. And that's just something that in order to make progress, I think we all have to work through.
We're trying to do our small part at the CryptoCounsel to put some positive news in this space because it's a tendency of all the news to go negative. So just to confirm your point, I will read that headline about Russia, which is Russia is about to try using crypto to get around sanctions. That's a pretty standard headline in the crypto space for foreign policy. But I think this conversation has shown how meaningful international engagement on digital trade, data flows, can pave the way for a more productive and positive use of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. So thank you so much for those insights, and thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been great.